So, hello everybody, and welcome to this class in human biology. I welcome you all, despite the current difficulties. I hope that you're able to enjoy this class and to learn a lot from it. There are a couple of things to tell you about running the class. First of all, I usually post the PowerPoint presentations for each class the day before our class so that you have a chance to go over it. Second of all, a Zoom class, as you can see, is recorded for each class and for each lecture set. On a couple of occasions, a single recorded Zoom class may extend over more than one class. And I'll make that clear to you. Please have a look. I'm not going to go over it because you can simply read it on your own. Please go over the syllabus requirements and the calendar and look at it very carefully. Make careful note of when you have class tests coming up because there are no makeups for class tests. You must do the class test at the set time on the set date. In the case of class tests, your lowest grade is dropped. So if you happen to miss a test, then that counts as your missed class. But I strongly advise you that you need to write all the tests. Do not think that you can budget your time by missing a test. It's a very, very bad idea. At the end of the semester, you will have a comprehensive exam which is drawn from the tests that you've written during the semester. And the other thing is these classes are recorded asynchronously. That is deliberate, is so that you can schedule classes, you can schedule your viewing at your own leisure, but it places a tremendous burden of responsibility on you, and that is to ensure that you keep up with viewing the classes, keep up with your reading, keep up with viewing the classes. Do not allow them to accumulate and think, well, I'll do them all next week, because there's a lot of material coming your way and you need to be able to do it slowly, and you need to allow time to do it repetitiously. That is the key to remembering things. The key to remembering material is to repeat it. To view it repeatedly. When you're viewing, to make your own notes, even if you've printed out the PowerPoint sets, make your own notes. When you study, make your own notes, make summaries of your own notes, write, read and write. Look at the bottom here and see what I've said there. Those who read succeed. Now I want to have a word about that. When I say people who read succeed, I'm not only referring to people who read the textbooks or people who read their notes. People who read generally, people who read widely, read novels, read text, read religious texts, read magazines. People who read succeed. They succeed in themselves, and they very often that translates into success in life in general. It's very, very important that, that you develop a habit of reading. And I strongly advise you to set aside time each day when you put aside all of your screens and you sit and read a book, read a comic novel, read a magazine, but read, sit with paper in your hand and read it. We don't really understand why, but there is some neurological basis to us accumulating information much better when we read it off a page rather than reading it off a screen or just listening. Combine all those things. Combine what you've got to watch on the screen with reading, with general reading, reading for pleasure, and you'll be well away. Okay, so this is a class in human biology. And it behooves us then to understand both of those things. We want to understand what biology is, and we want to understand how is human biology different to general biology, and how is it so? So let's have a look first of all at the question of this word biology. Biology is the scientific study of life. Now, included in those two, just follow my pointer here. I know it's small, but hopefully if you see it moving, you'll spot it. The first word to concentrate on is that, scientific. We're going to discuss this later on at the end of this Zoom class. And the scientific, it has a specific meaning. Science is a particular discipline. It has particular methods of investigation. So biology is the scientific study of life. We want to understand what life is before we do anything else. But then we're going to have a look at how we study it scientifically. Now, when we talk about life, it's very, very difficult for us to come up with a simple definition, like a one-sentence definition of what life is, what constitutes life. But if we think about it, it's something to do with order. It is something to do with having processes which are directed and orderly. And they allow organisms to exist. They allow things which are alive to exist. And what those organisms do is that they gather energy. First of all, everything requires energy. Everything the organism does is work, and work requires energy. That's the definition of energy. Energy allows work to take place. So a living organism has to gather energy, and it has to gather molecules. It has to build its structure. And it uses that structure to do things. Move, for example, reproduce. It's all of those sorts of things. All of them are going to require energy, and they're going to require molecules. We're going to find out that if you go into it, actually the energy is transferred by molecules, but it's energy usage nonetheless. So a biologist actually asks specific kinds of questions about living things. How does a single cell work? How does it develop into an organism? How do living things reproduce? And very importantly, how do living things actually interact with one another? Now, when I'm talking about this, always be thinking, how does this apply to a human being, right? How is it that a single cell, the fertilized ovum, develops into a whole human being? How does that happen? How do we reproduce? What are our reproductive strategies? They're actually very complicated. And they extend all the way from the cellular level up to the organismal level. For us as human beings, one of the really important things, that's my cat's tail, by the way. One of the really important things about human beings is the way in which we interact, with our environment and with other organisms is actually rather different to the way that other organisms do. It's one of the things which distinguishes us. So we were going to be asking, how do living things interact in community with other organisms? So human biology, first of all, it recognizes the fact that we are organisms, and we actually belong in a particular group of organisms we share very close characteristics with. So in one way, we're nothing but organisms just like other organisms are. We do exactly the same things that other organisms do. We eat, we move, we reproduce, we breathe, all of these things. This is what all organisms do. But human biology asks, what is specific about especially our interaction with the non-living world and with the living world around us, because that is what distinguishes us as human beings. So that's something that we're going to have to examine. So let's think about this, the living world for a start. And let's ask a question. What is it that makes something alive? When a scientist looks at something, when a scientist looks at a pair of pliers, They move, well, they can be moved, but they do not transfer energy. They don't do any of those things. Here, I'm going to pick up my cat. Here's my cat. How's my cat? Isn't he beautiful? How's my cat different to a pair of pliers or nippers, whatever? Well, a living organism is very different. A living organism has life, and as scientists, we recognize something about living. We recognize two major things about living things. Okay, the first is all living things consist of cells. I consist of cells, you do, my cat does. Our fundamental unit of life as organisms is the cell. The cell itself is defined by one important feature, which we'll discuss in a little bit of detail in a minute. And that is, all cells have around them a cell membrane. They have a very, very thin membrane which encloses them. And that membrane is what defines the cell. It defines it geographically, but it defines it in a profound way as well that I'll discuss in a minute. The second thing about all living things on our planet, maybe it's different on some other planet, who knows? But on our planet, all cellular activity, the cell is the fundamental unit of life. All the activity of the cell is directed by this molecule, deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. And that DNA is organized, and it's very carefully organized into the form of genes. And those genes are the recipes for everything that happens inside the cell, for all of the processes in the cell. So all cellular activity is directed by those instructions contained in the DNA. And those two facts unite all living things. Every living thing has those two characteristics. Every living thing consists of at least one cell. Every living thing has DNA as the master molecule, which drives all its processes, and, by the way, which is the agent of inheritance, so that the organism can reproduce. It hands on all of those instructions to its progeny. There's an important reason why we all share that, why we share those characteristics. And that is, we are actually all related to one another. All living things, from the simplest bacterium all the way up to us, if you want to consider it as a hierarchy, we are all related to one another. We share more similarities than we share differences. And that is because of the process of evolution, where all living things are the product, all living things that we see around us today are the product of nearly 4 billion years of evolution that has led to this enormous diversity that we see around us, and it has led to us just as much as any other organism. So let's have a look. Here's a cell. And I'll just explain a couple of basic things because we'll talk more about the structure in a while. But for the moment, I just want you to have a look. This is a general kind of animal cell, but around the outside of the cell, describing the whole of the cell around here, is a thin membrane. It's only 2 molecules thick, but its existence is very, very, very profound. So this membrane, in fact, is a boundary, and it allows things inside the cell to be different. It allows conditions inside the cell to be different to conditions outside. For example, it allows the cell to accumulate a lot of material. In fact, the cell accumulates so much material that the inside here is like a gel. It's like jello, and it's called the cytoplasm. In this particular kind of cell, there are many smaller subunits, which are called the organelles. We'll talk about it more in a while. Each of them has their own membrane. Each of their membranes allows the inside of the organelle to be different to the outside. The existence of this boundary is a very profound thing. So biologists recognize the fact that all life is based on a cell, and all cells arise from another cell. You don't get spontaneous generation of cells. Even if I was to take a flask and put into it all of the components of the cell, all of the chemicals, everything that make up the cell, shake it up as much as I like, it's not going to help me. It's not going to organize itself into a cell. Every living cell arises from another living cell. So I'll just point out, I'm not going to do the details of the cell structure at the moment. We'll do that later. But I just want you to notice this sitting in here, in the middle here, this is an organelle. It's a special organelle which contains all the hereditary material, or at least most of it. And that's the nucleus. Let's keep that in mind because we're going to talk about it again in a second. So here, this is a generic kind of cell, and always remember the cell is defined by the cell membrane, and it is defined, not only does the cell membrane, it doesn't really give us its shape, but it's around the outside, so it describes it geographically. But it defines the cell because every cell has a cell membrane. So if you see the cell membrane, you know you're dealing with a cell. In addition, we said all life is based on the control exerted by deoxyribonucleic acid. Please memorize that. Okay. Deoxyribonucleic acid, you probably know it already. We're not going to discuss the structure of it at the moment, but it's this very beautiful molecule, in many cases, extremely long molecule. And it consists actually of two molecules, two halves that are joined together. There's one half there, here's another half here, and it forms this beautiful lazy spiral in space. It's a double helix. And we'll talk more about its structure later on. So here's why the cell membrane is so important. Just think that if the cell membrane didn't exist, so say we have some sort of necessary cellular process that needs to take place. Well, in order for that process to take place, you've got to accumulate the things which are going to react with one another. So you've got to bring them, you've got to accumulate them, you've got to get them to a certain concentration in proximity to one another. Now imagine if you don't have a cell membrane. First of all, it's going to be very difficult to get the components of a reaction together because you're not going to be able to concentrate them. They're going to diffuse out continuously. They're going to disappear. Second of all, even if you get the reaction going, all of the product of that reaction, which may be very, very useful to you as a cell, all the product of that, if you've got no cell membrane or no membrane around containing it, is all going to diffuse. If this is happening in the sea, it'll diffuse into the whole sea and the concentration becomes so low that the reactions can't happen and the product is no longer useful to you because the concentration is so low. Instead, surrounding the cell is a membrane. Surrounding the organelles is a membrane. And that membrane can control what goes in and what goes out. So the membrane allows conditions on the one side of the membrane to be different to the conditions on the inside. And it allows the cell, first of all, to concentrate stuff, to keep control of products, and all of those processes are facilitated by the existence of membranes, the cell membrane, and then when we talk about organelles, the organelle membranes. There are cells which only have a cell membrane. They only have a cell membrane. Those are things like the bacteria, as you'll see in a minute. Other cells, the one that I just showed you, they have the cell membrane, and then they have other membranes on the interior, describing organelles within the cytoplasm. Those are more advanced cells. So have a look here. Here are the two kinds of cell. This kind here is a simple kind of cell. It only has a membrane around the outside. It only has a cell membrane. Often it's called the plasma membrane. And I'm not going to fuss about whether you call the one on the outside a plasma membrane or a cell membrane. On the interior, they have no other membranes. All of their processes take place within the cytoplasm. Even their DNA, because they're living things, they have DNA as their hereditary material. Their DNA is inside the cytoplasm, but it has no protective membrane around it the way other cells do. These kinds of cells are called the prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotic means early cell. So this is typical of the bacteria. They are usually small. They don't get very large because they need to have everything in proximity. They have no membranes inside to concentrate stuff inside the cytoplasm. So the stuff everything needs to be quite close to everything else in order for processes to take place. Again, the DNA lies loose inside the cytoplasm. That's not to say it's disorganized. It's very, very, very well organized, but it does not have a membrane around it the way we're going to see now other cells do. This here is typical of an animal cell, and it is a eukaryotic cell, a truly cellular cell. That's what this means, truly cellular. Again, it is described by a membrane all the way around the outside. It's too thin for you to see. It's only 2 molecules thick. It's extremely thin, but it's very powerful. So all the way around is the cell membrane. And then on the inside, there are many, in the eukaryotic cell, there are usually many, many organelles, which are described by their own membranes. So here we have, first of all, we have a system where we have a cell membrane around the outside. It allows the outside of the cell to be different to the inside of the cell. But in the eukaryotic cells, we take it a step further, because now we have membranes around the organelles, and it allows the organelle, inside of the organelle, to be different to the outside. It allows the inside of the organelle to be different to the cytoplasm. And that means that this kind of cell, the eukaryotic cell, they can start to specialize function. These organelles all have their own special functions, very specialized. There are many different types of organelle. We'll just see a few of them, but each of them is described by their own plasma membrane, and each of them has their own particular function. Here's the largest and most prominent organelle of all, and that is the nucleus. For most of the life of the cell, it has a membrane around it. There's one point at which the membrane will disappear, and that is when the cell divides, because some special processes need to happen when the cell divides. We'll talk about that much later on. The nucleus has its own nuclear membrane, and inside is most of the DNA of the cell. 99.9% of the DNA of a cell is inside here, inside the nucleus in a eukaryote. There's a little bit outside, which you'll hear about much later on. But this is most of the DNA, which is driving all of the processes of the cell. There's a system of communication between the nucleus and the cytoplasm that we'll hear described a bit later. So prokaryote cells, simple, small, no nucleus, no other organelles, only a cell membrane around the outside. Eukaryotic cells, larger, they've got to fit all this stuff in them. That's why. They're larger. They also have a cell membrane, of course, because the cell membrane always defines the cell. But inside they have membranes. They have plasma membranes, which describe the different organelles, and each of the organelles has its own specific function. So we're not going to discuss the functioning of DNA in great detail at the moment, but I just want to mention a little bit about it and about why it is so important. DNA, in fact, has a relatively simple structure for many years, the scientists didn't think it was a particularly important molecule because its structure is so simple. It's a very, very large molecule. And it is large because it carries a huge amount of information. It carries the information, it carries the recipes for all of the proteins in your cell. And the cell is basically run by proteins. It's mostly protein for a start. The cell is mostly protein. But all of the processes are run by proteins. And the recipe for all of those proteins, all the thousands of proteins that we require, are all contained in DNA. So it has to be a very large molecule. All our life processes, the instructions for them originate in the DNA. And the DNA communicates with the rest of the cell through a special set of mechanisms that we will discuss briefly in another class. The most important thing about DNA, though, is that it is very easy for the cell to make copies of the DNA. And it happens very, very rapidly when the cell, every time a cell divides, it has to duplicate all of its DNA because its progeny, its daughter cells, have to inherit the same copy. They have to inherit the same recipes of the DNA. And so first of all, we need to, DNA can be replicated, and it can be replicated so that it hands on the information to daughter cells. In addition, DNA can be handed on to progeny in reproduction, during sexual reproduction, for example. The instructions contained in the DNA must be handed on to the progeny, to the offspring of an organism as well. So the first requirement of DNA is that it be accurately replicated, and it is. It is usually very, very accurately replicated. But think about this. I'll tell you right now that the very first living things from which we have all evolved were prokaryotes. And that was about 3.8 billion years ago that the first prokaryotic kinds of cell evolved from non-living materials. And right from that time, from the prokaryotic ancestor, sometimes called the ancestor, ancestor, everything else has arisen. We are all related to one another because we all share a common ancestor, and it is way back, nearly 4 billion years ago. But if DNA was absolutely accurately replicated, if DNA never changed from one cell to another, so we've got our ancestor divides. If it just produced a cell which was identical to it, and then again, and then again, and then again, and then again for 4 billion years, we'd all still be swimming in the primordial ooze. We'd all still be prokaryotes, but we're not. There a huge amount of change, a huge amount of adaptation has taken place from that early ancestor. And that change takes place because DNA is subject to modification. And when the recipe contained in DNA changes, we refer to it as a mutation. And very often mutations are bad things. They're not necessarily good for the process. They don't help. They may set a process back very often. So mutations very often are not useful. They are deleterious. But every now and again, a mutation arises which is beneficial to the organism. It allows the organism to perform a process a little bit more efficiently than all the others around it. And when that happens, that organism stands a chance of doing a little bit better than all its fellows. And if it does better than all its fellows, it is probably going to reproduce more often. But guess what? The DNA is going to be handed on. That change, that mutation, which gave it that slight advantage, can be handed on to its progeny, and they will do better. And so on and so on and so on. And gradually they'll begin to outcompete the others. And that slow accumulation of changes is what drives evolution. That is what drives the changes that we observe as evolution. So DNA needs to be accurately replicated, but it mustn't be so absolutely faithfully replicated all the time. Usually it is, but just occasionally a mutation will occur, which is beneficial. But we're talking about an awfully long time. We're talking about 4 billion years. That's a very, very, very long time. And these small changes accumulate, and they drive the evolution of organisms. So here, just very briefly, I'll tell you that in living things, we will see that DNA is actually organized, and it's organized into the form of chromosomes. So in the prokaryotes, for example, most of the DNA is contained in one single chromosome, and it's a big circle inside the cell. But in most other, in the eukaryotes, the chromosomes are linear. It's a long strand of DNA. Each chromosome is a single strand of DNA. From organism to organism, it varies as to how many chromosomes there are. In human beings, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes. So there are 46 altogether. It varies a lot when you look at other animals and plants and etc. They have different numbers of chromosomes. The significance of the chromosome is that it contains most of the cell's genetic material, and it contains the DNA organized into the form of genes. And for our purposes, we can think that a single gene usually codes for a single protein. There are 1 or 2 exceptions, but don't worry about them. For our purposes, we can say a single gene is a single protein. And the gene, the recipe for each of those proteins, the gene is the unit of inheritance. And it's the parent hands across to the offspring, they hand the information in the form of the genes by transmitting to the offspring copies of the DNA. We'll see that in sexual reproduction, some special processes take place. Your DNA, for example, is not a copy of your parents' DNA. There's some things that happen to make you different, to make your DNA, your genome, some complement of your DNA, etc. There are some processes which make your DNA different to your parents' DNA. Yours is in fact a mixture of genes from your parents. This ability of DNA to be inherited, we can think of it in 2 forms. The first is there's cell division is taking place inside you the whole time. There are 2 forms of cell division in human beings just as much as in any other organism. The first is ordinary cell division. And this is a cell division of growth. For example, you grew from a single egg, in a single fertilized egg, to form the whole organism. That happened because that cell was able to divide faithfully over and over and over and over and over again and produce the organism. The second type of division is the division which is required for sexual reproduction. And that division is different. The first is called mitosis. The second is called meiosis. So meiosis is a special sort of division which is associated with sexual reproduction. Mitosis is a form of cell division which is associated with normal cell growth or cell replacement. For example, your skin cells divide very rapidly over and over again because they're not very long-lived. So to maintain your skin cells reproduce quite rapidly. Here are some pictures. these are pictures of cells which are busy dividing. And here you can see the blue strands here. Those actually are the chromosomes, and these cells are engaged in cell division. And these chromosomes have been duplicated. And here you can see that they're being pulled apart. Here they are here, pulled apart as the cells divide. This is a process of mitosis. So this cell ends up being identical to that cell. Originated from this cell, duplicated all its chromosomes, portioned them out, half to this, half to that. So each of them receives exactly the right number of chromosomes and a copy, an exact copy of one another, unless a mutation is taking place. But that happens very rarely. Okay, so now let's think about this. I've described to you what the cell is. And it's obvious. The cell is made up of molecules, often very, very, very complicated molecules. We're going to discuss them in a little bit of detail later in another class. Not in huge detail, but you just need to know that living things are made up of matter. We are made up of molecules. And the fundamental unit of matter that we depend on is carbon. Carbon is the basis of all living things on our planet. There has been speculation in science fiction or whatever about other planets which have other fundamental bases for living systems, but carbon is the basis for all of our biomolecules. Biomolecule is a molecule which is involved in living processes. So carbon is the basis of all our biomolecules. That's not to say it's the only one. There are many others that are involved, but carbon, as we'll see, forms the skeleton and the basis for all of our molecules. It may have other things like nitrogen, potassium, etc., associated with the molecules that are made, but their skeleton is always going to be carbon. So we have to get that carbon. We have to find that carbon from somewhere. We breathe in carbon the whole time. We breathe in carbon dioxide the whole time. But we can't use that. We need to take in carbon in the form of nutrients. We need to take it in the form of molecules, which we can then digest, absorb, and modify. So we have to obtain our carbon from somewhere. And because when we look around us, we realize we're always eating stuff which is basically dead. It's already been constructed. It's already been made. We either eat plant material or we eat animal material, and we digest it and utilize it. Organisms which do that are called heterotrophs. But there's another huge group of organisms that we need to think about. We're not, unfortunately, in this class, not going to be able to talk about them very much. But you need to think about the fact that there are organisms which can use carbon dioxide as a nutrient. And those are the plants and things like that. Because what they do is they take in carbon dioxide and they take in water and they build biomolecules out of it. And that is called carbon fixation. We are unable to fix carbon. We depend on eating things where the carbon has already been fixed. So we are heterotrophs. Something which can use carbon dioxide as a source of carbon, those we call autotrophs. The plants use carbon dioxide and they use the sunlight energy in order to build biomolecules. And in fact, we all actually depend on the plants ultimately, because as we'll see, we have to have a continual supply of energy. We depend on the plants for grabbing the sun's energy and putting it into a form which is useful to us, along with the plants taking simple things like carbon dioxide, water, building biomolecules, which we can then use. We can take those biomolecules and we adapt them as we need them, but we can't breathe in carbon dioxide and make molecules out of it. It's impossible for us to do because we are heterotrophs. So with all of that discussion, you'll realize that when we said a scientist recognizes life because the cell is the basis of life. We said that inside that cell, there are all these life processes that are taking place, which are driven by recipes contained in the DNA. But we need to think about what are those life processes? What is happening inside a cell that makes it alive? And this is now quite a difficult thing to discuss because many of the things, we can duplicate many of the processes that take place outside of in a test tube or something like this, but they're not living processes at all. And the reason for that they're not living processes is because they're not organized the way that living processes are organized. So let's think about what a cell is actually doing. First of all living things acquire energy. We require a continual source of energy. And the reason for that is that it's a fundamental law of physics. Energy can't be created and it can't be destroyed, but it can be transformed. It can be transformed from one form to another. But every time you do that, that transformation is inefficient. It's inefficient. And if you want a measure of that, put your hand on your arm and feel. Feel that warmth that's coming out of you. That warmth is actually a waste product. It's a waste product of your own metabolism. And it's producing a form of energy which is completely biologically useless, which is heat. Heat eventually just radiates back out to space. Eventually, it leaves the planet. Nothing can use heat in the living process. So what is happening is we have to have a source of energy, which we get actually from our food. As heterotrophs, we get our energy and our molecules from food. We get our source of energy and we utilize that energy by changing it, by driving it through, using it to drive all sorts of different processes. But every time we drive a process, it's inefficient. We lose some energy. We lose energy. We have to replace that energy. We have to continually have a source of energy to keep the processes going. You deprive the organism, deprive the heterotroph of a source of energy, and the heterotroph will die. And it will die because it lacks the molecules and it lacks the energy which is required to keep the living processes going. So when we look at the processes that are taking place, we can break them down into two fundamental kinds. There are processes where we build molecules. We do this the whole time. We actually take components, small components, we put them together, and we build big molecules out of it, for example. Those processes of building are called anabolism. Anabolism are processes of building. If you may have heard that word, for example, anabolic steroid. Anabolic steroids are hormones which people can take, which enable them to build muscle. That's why they are anabolic. They are allowing the building of molecules. But many, many, many of our processes inside our cells are processes of breaking down molecules. And the classic example is if we break down molecules to use them as a source of energy, if we break down molecules which are serving as fuel, those processes of breaking down, and there are many of them, are called catabolic reactions. It's called breaking down of molecules is catabolism. So anabolism, building, catabolism, breaking down. And together, all of these processes, all wed to one another inside the cell, are referred to as the metabolism. Metabolism is all of the processes together, both anabolic and catabolic. Okay, so we've got an idea now that living things comprised of cells, governed by the recipes contained in their DNA. They gather molecules, they build the molecules, they shepherd energy around themselves, and that is how the organism is constructed and how it maintains itself. But organisms on our planet are required to interact. They are actually required to interact with two things. First of all, their physical environment, that's one. And second of all, they are required to interact with one another. And every organism interacts with its environment, non-living factors, and it interacts with living organisms as well. And those interactions actually affect each component. The organism in its environment affects the environment affects the organism. One organism interacting with another organism affects that. They each affect one another in one way or another. And this gives us a very useful way of modeling the way in which energy and matter flow, not just through the organism itself, but through all of the systems present on our planet. Because you need to think about in this way. You think about our planet, it is self-contained. It is a unit. It does not receive very much material from outside. It receives a very small amount in the form of a meteor, stuff coming in from outer space. But that's a small amount compared to the mass of the whole planet. Gives up a little bit as well, believe it or not. Our atmosphere continually gives up some molecules, but again, it's very, very little. So in terms of matter, in terms of the elements that comprise the planet, we are self-contained, and we don't give up, we don't gain very much from outside. We have to, anything that requires molecules, we've got to get them from our planet, somewhere on the planet. Energy is different. Energy comes in from outside. It comes in the form, first of all, of light from the sun and heat from the sun. The heat is not biologically useful. We may like the heat, but the heat may create conditions where life is possible, but it is not biologically useful. You can't use heat metabolically. There's no organism which can use heat metabolically. Instead, we depend on light. We depend on the sunlight. We depend on sunlight as a source of energy because every living process on Earth is inefficient. And every living process produces heat as a waste product. And that heat is then radiated back out. So we continually lose energy. We continually need a source of energy. In other words, molecules on our planet must be recycled. We've got to keep on using the same molecules over and over again because we only have a set store of molecules. But energy is a one-way flow. It's the energy comes in as sunlight and eventually it ends up being radiated back out to space. Energy is continually lost, but molecules are not. So there's the two things. We said life processes are something to do with matter, building biomolecules, et cetera, but they're also something to do with managing energy. And we can have a look and try and see how is it that the living things on the planet, for example, they interact with the environment and with one another to do those things, to recycle the molecules, and then also to gain energy, to the energy that we continually use. And in fact, living organisms are continually transforming energy and losing heat as well. So we need the continuous source of energy to keep our ecosystems going. Have a look here. This is seen in Africa. an elephant. Elephants eat plant material, so we call them herbivores. Elephant is also a heterotroph. The elephant depends on already constructed biological molecules, and on already fixed energy to survive. It can't breathe in carbon dioxide, it can't photosynthesize, it can't go lie in the sun and make molecules. It is absolutely, the elephant is absolutely dependent on molecules which have already been made, and it's getting them from plants. This tree here is doing something very, very important. It is taking sunlight, which is useless to a heterotroph. It is taking sunlight, and it is using that sunlight to build biological molecules. At the same time, it is taking in carbon dioxide, a very simple molecule with one atom of carbon to it, and it's taking in water. And it's combining carbon dioxide and water in the process of photosynthesis to make very complex biomolecules that make up the body of the plant. And the heterotroph can now come along and it can actually use those molecules, and it can use the energy. And it's an amazing thing to think of, that all of the energy that drives the elephant is in fact sunlight. It's sunlight, it's the energy of sunlight which is being transformed, because living things transform energy all the time. Plants transform light into biomolecules. The elephant transforms energy, it takes in the biomolecules, and it uses the plant biomolecules as a source of matter to build its huge body. But it uses the energy contained in those molecules as well to fund all of the energetic processes that it needs to. So here's what I meant about the molecules on our planet having to be recycled. Just think about this for a minute. If this tree was to take in carbon dioxide, take in this carbon from the atmosphere, build biomolecules, and then last forever. Nothing ever happened to those molecules. Once the carbon dioxide had been fixed into some big biomolecule, then that molecule just never, ever changed. Just think about what sort of planet would we live on. Well, everything, all the carbon would end up tied up in these ever-living plants, right? The planet is self-contained. It only has a certain number of carbon molecules for everybody to use. And those carbon molecules need to be budgeted. If they all end up being taken in by plants and they would never ever change thereafter, they wouldn't be available to anybody else to use. So in actual fact, what our planet consists of is an intricate system whereby we recycle. And this is the sad but essential thing, is that death is essential for life. Things have to die and they have to decay, because the molecules that make them up need to be contributed back to the planet for other things to use. The plant requires carbon dioxide. If other plants had taken all of the carbon dioxide and built it into plant molecules which never re-entered the cycling, then new plants could not form. Instead, when the plant, here's a plant, but it has a specific lifespan. In fact, bits of it have different lifespans. The leaves may have shorter lifespan than the whole organism, but the tree itself has a set lifespan. So does leaves, etc., etc., and they die. And when they die, they fall to the soil and they are decomposed. And that is what the process of decomposition is. It's taking complex molecules and then making them simple again. The plant takes simple things, it makes them complex. So does the animal to a large extent. It takes in food and it changes all the molecules, makes complex molecules of its own. At the same time, there is waste. The animal produces a huge amount of waste, which is also decomposed and ultimately ends up being simple molecules again, simple things like carbon dioxide, water, for the process to carry on. So remember this, that we recycle our molecules. We recycle the elements that make up our planet. But what about the energy? Well, the energy comes in the form of sunlight. The energy is fixed by this special group of organisms, the plants and things like that, which we call autotrophs, which are able to take the sunlight and change the nature of the energy. They change that sunlight energy, the light energy, into chemical energy. They take simple things like carbon dioxide and water, and they turn them into big complex molecules by binding them together with energetic bonds, which are formed from energy from the sun. So that's how it is essential that all organisms interact with one another. If they did not interact with one another in life and in death, these processes would grind to a halt. Okay, so let's have a look now at how biologists will look at all living things, and then how they try to make sense of what they see. Well, the principal way in which scientists will look at all living things that they see on the planet is, first of all, they'll try to put together things by similarity. When we look at organisms, we realize that some are much more similar to one another and form what look like natural groups by their characteristics. Can be morphology, the way that they are constructed, the way they look. Can also be by function, by specific things that they do, which enable us to put them together. So when we do this, I won't go into all of the detail of why, but we recognize that there are actually three big groupings, huge groupings of organisms, which we call the domains. So there are three domains of life, and they are as follows. The first domain are the bacteria. And of course, you've heard about bacteria over and over again. We've already discussed how a bacterium has a simple cell, has a cell membrane, and no other membranes. There is another group which are somewhat similar to the bacteria called the archaea, which we will not talk about again. The archaea and the bacteria together are prokaryotes. These are the two groups that have only a cell membrane and no interior membranes. Everything else is eukaryotic. And all of the eukarya is called the domain eukarya. They all have cells which have a nucleus. And they have an area of the cell surrounded by a membrane which contains most of the DNA of the cell. And they will have, it depends on what you're talking about, but they will have other, or may have other organelles as well, each of them with their own membrane around it, performing some specialized function. When we look at the eukaryotes, we see actually four big groupings. And the first group are easy to recognize. They are multicellular organisms which are autotrophic. They are able to photosynthesize. Photosynthesis is that process that I talked about before, taking carbon dioxide and water and reshaping carbon dioxide and the water together to make biomolecules using the energy from the sun. That is the process of photosynthesis. Multicellular organisms which can perform that process, photosynthesis, we call the plants. So that is one big grouping. And these groupings we call kingdoms. The next grouping is the kingdom fungi. And these are the things like mushrooms and all sorts of things, but also some simpler organisms, some not necessarily all multicellular. Some of the fungi are unicellular, single cell, and those we call the yeasts, but they're all in the same group. Here, this is the kingdom fungi. Mushrooms, etc., etc., etc. They have the characteristics, they are unable to photosynthesize. They are heterotrophic, but they do not eat. Instead, they release enzymes and things into the soil wherever they are. And they break down stuff into simpler molecules, which they absorb from the outside. Those are the fungi. Then there is our group, and that is the kingdom Animalia. And the kingdom Animalia is a very large grouping, not as large as the plants, by the way, but they have one big characteristic that distinguishes them from everything from the plants, and that is that they are heterotrophic and they eat their food. So these are heterotrophic and absorb food from the outside. Animals are multicellular organisms which are heterotrophic, which eat their food. There is another difference as well. I'll just in the structure of the cells, but we don't have to worry about it, which distinguishes animals from plants and from fungi. So there's some cellular differences as well. It's a very, very clear group, the kingdom Animalia. Then there's another group, and this is a ragtag group called the protists. And the protists are eukaryotes which don't fit into any of these groups. There's a whole mishmash. Some of them are autotrophs, some are heterotrophs, some are single cell, many are multicellular, on and on and on and on. It's just a ragtag group, and they just simply are not plants, they're not fungi, and they're not animals. That would be their distinguishing feature. So, let's have a look and ask ourselves now, within the kingdom Animalia, what exactly are human beings? Because we can look within the kingdom Animalia and we can start to lump animals together by their characteristics. Or do we look like birds? Some ways we do, in many ways we don't. Do we look like monkeys? Yes, we do. We look very much like monkeys. We're very different, but we look very much. We can look within the kingdom Animalia and we can start to say, okay, human beings bear this similarity to other animals and these differences, and we can start to put ourselves into a group. So the very first thing we know, we are eukaryotes. All of our cells are eukaryotic. We have a nucleus. We have many other organelles inside, so we don't only have a cell membrane. That's the first thing. Second, we're in the kingdom Animalia. We are multicellular and consist of billions of cells. And we eat our food. And that is basically what makes us animals. We belong to a group called the chordata. Now this is I just want you just to remember that. Okay, we belong to this group called the chordata. It is our phylum. But strangely enough, we are in that group, the chordata, along with some very strange relatives. And things like, for example, like lampreys, those sorts of things. And some very distinctly invertebrate organisms as well. So this is the chordata is a very big, diverse group. There is one characteristic. There's a particular anatomical feature called the notochord, which they all have. And that is what unites them. So just remember, all I want you to remember is the name. Our phylum, human beings' phylum, is the phylum chordata. We are mammals. In the phylum chordata, there are many different groups. The reptiles, for example, are also called it. So are the fish, so are the shark. There are all sorts of groups that are in the phylum chordata. And the mammals have very particular characters. So we are mammals because, for a start, we have hair, and that is characteristic of mammals. The second thing is that we feed our young with milk. That is another characteristic of the mammals. So you may, as I say that, you may kind of be thinking, but there are things without hair, which are mammals. I'll give you an example. For example, the whales, they're mammals. You may look at dolphins, you may look at them and say, oh, but they don't have hair. Well, they do. They actually do have hair. They have hair in the uterus, they still have hair. And also there are many whales, for example, which have adapted hair. These are the whales which are filter feeders. They filter their food out of the water, and they filter that water with baleen, and that is hair. That is a modified hair. So the whales do, in fact, have hair. They just don't have hair as adults. It'd be useless to them, so why have hair? So Mammalia, the class Mammalia, remember those two things. First of all, they have hair. Second of all, they feed their young with milk. Now, some of you may, if I asked you what characterizes mammals, some of you might say, whenever I ask that question, a lot of people will answer and say mammals have live birth. Well, that is not actually true. There are mammals, there are primitive mammals, such as the duck-billed platypus and the echidna and various things in Australia, which actually lay eggs. There are mammals which lay eggs, but the duck-billed platypus is a mammal because it has hair and it feeds its young hatch from eggs, but it feeds its young with milk. So they are mammals, but there are primitive mammals, and in eons ago, our ancestral mammals were egg-laying organisms, but now most mammals give live birth. Within the mammals, there is a very distinct group called the primata, the primates, and we are primates. The primates have some particular characteristics. We won't go into all of them, but we'll hear hopefully later on if I talk a little bit about human evolution. The first thing is all primates have forward-facing eyes with good binocular vision. All primates have a grasping hand. They have a grasping hand and a thumb. And there are a couple of other characteristics. But if we think about the primates, just think about us together with monkeys, together with gibbons or orangutans or whatever, and think about our morphology, and you'll realize that we actually physically resemble one another quite strongly. There are obviously major differences between us, but we do definitely resemble one another. Our next group, to which we as humans belong, are called the Anthropoidea. And these are the apes. And they are the primates without tails. So think, for example, our fellow anthropoids are things like the orangutan, the gorilla, the chimpanzees, very, very important. The chimpanzees are very, very, very close to us. Bonobos, even closer. So the Anthropoidea is a relatively small group, but it's very, very distinct. And it's from that group that human beings arose, the apes without tails. So our genus is Homo, and Homo means man. So first of all, I want to point out all animals are given a name, a scientific name, which consists of two parts. The first is called the genus, G-E-N-U-S name, and our genus is Homo. And that simply means man. Our species is sapiens. Sapiens means wise. So our name means wise man. If you follow the news, you might wonder if that is strictly true. It's probably, the name Homo sapiens, probably more an aspiration than a reality. But nonetheless, we regard ourselves as being wise men, Homo sapiens. Man being the generic man, just the type. So Homo sapiens, I want to point something out. We are the last remaining species of this genus Homo. But in fact, even up until in geological time, relatively recently. There were many species. There have been many species of Homo. We have had many, 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 many relatives in the same genus as us, dating far back, millions of years. And Homo sapiens, what distinguishes us is our ability to, first of all, to make fine movements with our finger and thumb, to make very fine movements like that, and our very advanced ability to make tools. Other organisms do definitely make tools. Chimpanzees can make tools, but they make simple tools. We are able to make relatively complex tools. We are able to adapt things to make tools. I want to finish off by just returning to this idea of unity, of evolution, and how evolution actually unites all living things. Evolution unites all living things because we're all derived from a common ancestor. Evolution has applied to that common ancestor and has resulted in huge diversity that we see around us today. So when we look at all living things, we can actually see traces of this unity. There's a very famous quote from a famous biologist called Theodosius Dobzhansky. And he says, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Nothing makes sense in biology. It is literally true. You cannot take a process, look at it in isolation and really understand it unless you look at that same process in all other organisms and understand its origins. So evolution explains patterns of unity, but it also explains patterns of diversity in living things. And when we look through it, we're all modified descendants of common ancestors. We all share that prokaryote ancestor way back 4 billion years ago, for example. But the chimpanzees and us also share an ancestor. And our little group, the chimpanzees and humans together, we share a common ancestor with the gorillas, and so on and so on. So when we look at a chain of evolution like that, we can understand how it is we inherit so many things which are similar. It's the dissimilarity that makes us a separate group, but similarities betray our common ancestry. So we descend from common ancestors, and the differences are because we inherit changes which were slightly beneficial in an ancestor that gave it a slight advantage, which enabled it to reproduce more. When we look at living things, we can see the traces of that if we look at particular organs, for example. So here's a classic example. And this is taking two organisms which almost could not be further apart. And that is a protozoan. It's a protist, actually, but it's a protozoan called Paramecium. And it's this little simple single-celled organism. It's an aquatic organism, and it swims and it feeds by having these hairs all over the outside. And those hairs are called cilia, and they move like this. And they can beat in unison rather, to enable the organism to move through the water. So they speed the organism through the water. So here is a single cilium here. And if you look at the cilium, you look at it, if you cut it in half and you look at it under an electron micrograph, this is what it looks like. It has a very, very complex structure. These are all little tubes, and the tubes actually all operate together like this to cause this cilium to beat like that. So that's fine. It's easy to understand why it's got it. It's easy to understand how they work, how they beat to row the organism through water. But now have a look at us. Go into our into our respiratory tract and have a look there. And what do you find? You find cilia. And now the cilia are fixed. The cilia aren't going to move you, but the cilia are going to move fluid above them. And what they do is they move a sheet of mucus, which is essentially a fluid. They move a sheet of mucus from your lungs up towards your throat. They keep your lungs clean by continually beating. By the way, those of you who smoke might be interested to know that this is the first thing to go when you damage your lungs from smoking. Very, very soon after you start smoking, you start to damage the cilia in your respiratory tract. They stop being able to move this sheet of mucus efficiently. That's why long-time smokers end up with this terrible cough, because they have to cough up the mucus. The cilia don't work anymore. Under normal circumstances, the cilia beat. And they beat in exactly the same way as these cilia beat. And if we look at the structure, we cut them in half, look at the structure is identical. It is absolutely identical in cross-section. And the reason for that is that the structure and function of that cilium has been preserved through evolution because it works so well. Why fiddle with something? Why reinvent the wheel? Why reinvent the cilium? The cilium has evolved and works very well. And it is, as things evolve, they keep the things which work well. And they improve the things, they improve the function of other things. They may adapt things to a new function, as here. Here in the single-celled organism, it's used for movement. Here, of the whole organism. Here in a higher organism, in a vertebrate like us, they're used to actually move things, move other things. But they keep the same structure, and really their function is pretty similar too. Okay, so that's the end of this class. And just for fun, have a look at this. It's a little bit grisly, but it's just to introduce you to the structure of the human body in its entirety. And we will have another class on Friday.